Let's check, yeah. So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on where you're coming from. Thanks for joining us for our 5th Consultative Committee webinar for this Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. Today, I think it's a really interesting one. It pulls together a lot of very topical issues, which viewed through the lens of sustainability create some real challenges and opportunities. So we have some really interesting people to talk to us today about international markets and trade. My name is Michael Maxwell. I'm a partner with HFW. I've spent too many years to count working in international risk, trade, and a mix of legal areas that feed in naturally into sustainability. So many years ago, I started off looking mostly at supply chains and the obligations on Australian entities operating in places like Africa and Asia, the Middle East. And through the years, that's evolved into as the world sort of come along with it, into a much more holistic, broader view of things. And since 2017, I've been on the Sustainability Steering Group. And I have a science background as well. I did postgraduate in pharmacology and toxicology. So for me, that mix of what the steering group is trying to do, which is bring together the best evidence that we can either identify that already exists or go and get if it doesn't, and use that to inform what the Australian red meat industry is going to do, or to better communicate what it's already doing that supports the various limbs of sustainability, is a really interesting and really rewarding thing to be doing. Today, I'll run you through the agenda just quickly. We're sticking to a pretty tight timeline. A couple of our panelists, in fact, I think all of our panelists, have a very hard 11:30 sign-off time. So if we're getting close to 11:30 and things are still really going, we might lose our panelists. We can keep going for a little bit, but I'll at least give them a chance to sign off before we do. You've heard from me. We're going to have a talk today from Tim Ryan on trade market access in the post-COVID era, and I'll introduce Tim a bit more in a minute. I think we have a fantastic mix of panelists where we've got really both limbs of the Australian red meat export industry, processed meats and live export. We've got Tim, of course, who's got the particular expertise and can communicate that comes from within MLA. And then we have Bob Huskey, a very well-credentialed international customer representative who also has a particular focus on Australia. So we'll step through those. We'll try and give as much time for the discussions as we can. There are the usual housekeeping points, and we're all getting used to these now with Zoom meetings, but although it's a panel webinar, and probably initially there'll be a bit more of a discussion by or between the panelists about some of the issues that they're particularly interested in. It is a meeting, so we'd like you to contribute as much as you feel comfortable doing. If everyone can keep their sound on mute, obviously, just in case, like me, you've got kids in the background, that can become a little distracting for everybody. If you do want to just talk, I'm reasonably comfortable with people. If there isn't a lot of discussion.
Michael's internet does drop in and out. He'll be back with us shortly. Tim, if you're okay, while we wait for Michael to join us again, would you like to run into your presentation?
Yeah, that sounds good, Jacob.
Excellent, thanks. I'd just like to introduce Tim Ryan from Meat and Livestock Australia. Tim is the Manager of Global Trade Development based in Singapore, and will be presenting on trade and market access in the post-COVID era. So you should be right to share your screen now, Tim.
Thank you. So that Hopefully you can see my screen. Thanks for the introduction, Michael and Jacob. So like Jacob said, my name is Tim Ryan. I'm based in Singapore and work within our international offices and focus on trade and market access. This morning, I just wanted to provide a bit of context and maybe some thought provokers for the discussion later on. And I'll focus on trade market access and how they're being influenced by COVID-19. So I'll quickly run through these three topics this morning over the next 10 minutes or so. I want to paint a picture of what our current market access looks like. I want to really emphasise why market access and access to export markets is really important for the Australian beef industry. And then I'll finish on some of the impacts that we've seen COVID-19 have on trade and market access. So at a high level, the industry has two key long-term targets in this space. Firstly, on the economic access front, there's a priority to secure market access or preferential market access. This is free trade agreements, effectively, that cover 90% of our red meat exports. So this is really about focusing on removing tariffs and quotas that make it difficult and expensive to export product into international markets. And as we get progress and reform in that space, the other major area for focus is on non-tariff barriers. So these are all the things that make it difficult and expensive to export into our international markets. So these are everything that all the barriers that aren't covered under basically as a tariff. So there's also the target to reduce the impact of non-tariff barriers by $1 billion over the next 10 years. And these two key priorities outlined in Red Meat 2030 are also aligned with the Beef Sustainability Framework under Priority 4.1, barriers to trade. So all these strategic documents are pushing in the same direction, which is really positive. So just to bring those two KPIs to life, this is what our current market access really looks like. And so in terms of that target to have 90% of our trade covered by a free trade deal, we actually already have that for beef, and cattle exports is very similar with trade deals in most of our major markets. So this has all been really positive news, and you can see over the last 2 decades that increased share of our markets being covered by a trade deal. So this has really meant that quotas and tariffs have been stripped out from our export markets. So this has been really positive. It's added a lot of value back into the Australian beef industry, and also added a lot of stability to our exports. So as we've seen tariffs and quotas removed, we've also seen our exports become more diversified. And this red line here on the same chart is an index of diversification. So don't worry about the technical details behind it. The main thing to focus on is the direction it's moving. And the lower this index, the more diversified our export portfolio is. So back in the mid-2000s, we really relied upon Japan, Korea, and the US for the bulk of our exports. Now we've got China, Southeast Asia, the Middle East taking a lot more of our product. So really, we're a lot more diversified now than what we were back then. So we hear a lot of talk about the over-reliance on China. We've actually got a more diversified portfolio now than what we had 10 years ago. So generally on the economic access front, we've seen a positive shift. However, when it comes to NTBs, these are still quite burdensome. So this is a set of data from the UN Conference for Trade and Development, and it's not perfect because NTBs are notoriously hard to track and measure. But this is a count on the number of registered NTBs that would be applied to Australian beef in overseas markets. And clearly there's been a fairly consistent long-term trend of more of these impacting our trade. So while we have improved access in terms of reduced tariffs, we really need to focus on trying to remove these non-tariff barriers which still inhibit trade and add costs to our exports. So that's what our market access looks like. In terms of why market access is important for Australia, increasingly so, this is the domestic export split of our production base. You can see Australia on the left-hand side there. I've got 2020 versus 20 years ago. And you can see that exports are increasingly important for the Australian industry. And if you compare that to our major competitors, such as Brazil and the US, they've got much larger domestic markets they can fall back onto. So Australia has really benefited from the global trading system and access to export markets, but we're also really exposed to disruption in that system, particularly more so than our major competitors, such as the US or Brazil. Another major trend that we've seen over the last couple of decades is the increasing competitive pressure that we see in our beef and cattle export markets. This chart on the left-hand side looks at beef going into the major Asian beef markets, and Asia's really been where the battleground of this competition has been fought. If you look at 2009, you can see Australia's share of beef at the bottom there in green. In 2009, Australia basically had half the Asian beef market tied up. We were sheltered from a lot of competition from those other major suppliers, and we really carved out a massive share of the market. If you fast forward 10 years, our export footprint into Asia has grown, but there's a lot more beef coming from other corners of the world, particularly the United States and South America. So in this growing pie, there's a lot more competition. And a lot of that comes down to animal health and disease restrictions that have sheltered us in the past. So this table on the right-hand side looks at the major exporters and importers around the world and who had access where. So you can see on the top there, in 2006, Australia had access to the major beef markets that we currently serve. And we were really sheltered from the likes of the US, which had BSE at the time, and Brazil and India, which have and still do really have issues with foot and mouth disease. So for a period of time, we were really sheltered from this competition. If you fast forward to today, Australia's still got really good access, but the US has caught up and BSE is not really an issue for them anymore. While Brazil and India have also increased their access into Asia, particularly for Brazil, access into China has been huge for them. And even the US has now got access to a limited degree into Indonesia and the US. So overall, there's been a shift over the last 10 to 15 years of these other major suppliers encroaching onto markets that we were traditionally dominant in. And this has affected both beef and cattle export markets. So before I jump into impacts from COVID, I thought I'd just really highlight another major issue for beef and cattle exports at the moment. And that's really the 2 years of drought that we've seen and the herd liquidation, and now the change in seasonal conditions and the triggering of that herd rebuild that's underway at the moment. And a lack of cattle being processed and overall shortage of beef supply has really driven the trade outlook a bit lower over the next few years. So even before COVID-19 came along, we were forecasting a contraction in beef and cattle exports. And this outlook hasn't really changed between January and now. This is primarily being driven by fairly substantial supply side forces as opposed to disruption from COVID-19. That said, we have seen a range of areas where COVID-19 has impacted exports and supply chains. The first major impact that we saw was COVID-19 when it was in China. A lot of meat was sent to China in the last quarter of 2019 and the start of 2020. So there was a lot of meat sitting in reefer containers in Chinese ports and distribution centres. And as that country went to lockdown, the whole system seized up. So for a number of weeks, there was a global shortage of containers in circulation and reefer rates increased. Then as we saw COVID-19 spread around the world, a lot of passenger flights were grounded. And when passenger flights are grounded, the bulk of Australia's air freight capacity is also taken out of the system. So it's not the primary mode of transport for Australian exports, but in some markets it's particularly important, such as lamb into the Middle East or beef into some Asian markets like Hong Kong and Singapore. They primarily rely on air freight. So this has been a fairly major challenge for the industry. It's been supported with the IFAM mechanism to a degree, and some product has shipped across to sea freight containers, but overall it's hard to replace that lost capacity from the industry. The third major area we've seen disruption has been on supply chains themselves. On the live export side, it's been more difficult manning boats and getting vets onto boats with COVID-19 restrictions. And also in Victoria at the moment, we're seeing the impact of COVID-19 on processing workforces and the reduced capacity those plants are having to do to manage that COVID risk. Also, at the same time, we've seen impacts from on the market access front, with China not wanting to take product from plants that have had COVID-19 because of a perceived COVID food safety risk. So they're the major challenges. There have been some positive movements as a result of COVID-19 in the Middle East, where industry has been advocating for longer shelf life on product for years. COVID-19 acted as a catalyst to fast track some of those reforms. So there are current or planned shelf life changes for imported red meat into some of those key Middle Eastern markets, which is a positive. Lastly, overall, I think the supply chains have survived the disruption from COVID-19. Although there's been some clear challenges, meat and food are still managed to flow around the world. But where we may see COVID-19 materialize in the future is really on the geopolitical front. So really, COVID-19 has been a clear example of a lack of multilateral cooperation, and if anything, it's going to fuel more of the protectionist sentiment that we've seen from the likes of Trump, but also other pockets of the world. It'll probably be even harder for multilateral trade reform through organisations like the WTO, which are also currently leaderless. Another area where we may see COVID-19 materialise is in domestic industries around the world pressuring their governments for protection. We're going to go into a recession fairly soon, or we are in most parts of the world. Government budgets are going to be really stretched given the amount of cash they've already spent. So if industries are struggling and they can't get subsidies from governments, trade policy could be a measure that we see come through as a means for governments to protect local domestic industries. And lastly, we've seen photos around the world of empty food shelves. There could be increased concerns in countries, particularly Asia probably, around food security. And if those food security concerns materialise in the likes of more self-sufficiency, that would be bad for trade. I think positively we're starting from a base where global food trade has survived and done quite well through this disruption. So we can really argue the point that imports play a key role in that food security story. It's not just about countries trying to produce everything themselves. So that's all for me. Hopefully that's some food for thought. We can pick up any questions in the panel session shortly. Thank you.
You're still on mute there, Michael.
Rookie mistake. Sorry, everyone. Thanks, Tim, for that. That was a great lead-in. And sorry for dropping out. I didn't mention I'm in regional Western Australia at the moment. So I'm experiencing some of the problems that we all have in the regions from time to time and trying to get the same sort of access to tech that people in cities take for granted. We should be fine for now. So that's great, Tim. Now, if you've got any questions for Tim, we'll keep all the questions for the panel session, if that's okay, just so we can skip through all the introductory stuff. Pop them in the chat if you'd like me to address them, or just bring them up once we move out of there. I think I was going to quickly flag some survey results before introducing our panel members. This was updated last night. I think it's really interesting. Shows a really interesting sort of solid base on both of these metrics. So that confidence in economic security of international markets. I mean, to me, particularly given what's happened in the last 6 months or so, I think that's a really good, strong indication of confidence. It's not over exuberance and it's not fatalism, or catastrophizing anything. And I think that probably reflects within Australia, at least, an element of the fact that due to a combination of good luck and to an extent good management, we have more security in our supply chains than many other countries do, and including, for example, with Bob in the US, where they've had real challenges with their wet markets. So I think that reflects well on where we're at, I think, in terms of our own integrity and security of supply chains and what opportunities that creates for the international markets. And in terms of tracking towards red goals, I think that to me feels like a pretty good spread too. I'd be interested to hear anyone else's thoughts as we go through the discussion. You never please everyone all the time, and I think that one of the things that I like about what Red Meat is doing in tracking towards 2030 is that there are some real aspirational goals in there, but it's not a marketing piece. It really does have some substance behind it, and so that creates risks as well. You can't always meet the really ambitious but objectively measurable goals that you set for yourself. So to me, again, that feels like a pretty good place to be sitting, but I'd be very interested to hear how people feel about that, including our panelists. So we've got a really good mix of people today, and we have each of the peak councils for sort of the two limbs of our export industry, and we've also got, as I said, Bob from the Costco group in the US on the international customer side. So I'll quickly introduce each of them. I'll give each a chance to briefly say a little bit about the organisation and perhaps about themselves. I'll keep my introduction very brief so we don't double up, and then we'll have we'll open up the panel discussion. I think there are a few really interesting questions coming out of what Tim just took us through as well. Now, Mark is, as CEO of the Australian Livestock Exporters Council, has a really interesting background. So in addition to that real commitment to agribusiness, Mark's also got a Bachelor of Laws. And so he has a really interesting perspective on the nature and the source of many of those obligations that sit on the live export industry, right the way through the supply chain and uniquely amongst exporting countries that apply to exporters well beyond the point where they've relinquished ownership of the livestock. Mark, if you'd like to give us a quick intro, a little more detail on what ALEC does and yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be part of this panel discussion. So, as Michael outlined, I'm CEO of the Australian Livestock Exporters Council, and our role is principally to represent Australian exporters, both to governments and, of course, and very importantly, to the community. It's a trade that's not without its controversies, I suppose, but it's also a trade that generates very positive outcomes, both domestically for producers and also in market for a range of reasons, but particularly around food security and social development. So I hope to talk a little bit more about that throughout this session. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. And then from the other side of our export coin, we've got Patrick Hutchinson, CEO of the Australian Meat Industry Council and the Processed Meats Groups. Patrick's got a sort of a long personal and professional connection to agribusiness and extremely highly credentialed in what are very technical aspects of dealing with agribusiness and red meats. And I won't step on Patrick's toes by going through that, but I think that places him in a really unique position to talk about some of these challenges, not just from the usual, what are the export issues going on here, but what are some of the things that the processed meats industry has done and is doing to deal with challenges and take advantage of some of the opportunities that face the Australian red meat industry. Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you and good morning. And yes, apologies, I am one of those that has to duck off before or at 11:30. But the Australian Meat Industry Council, we have over just under 2,000 individual companies as members of ours, from independent retail butcher shops back through to wholesalers. We have corporate small goods makers, Primo and Don, those sorts of companies, right through to very small goods makers, and then back through to red meat processors, that's sheep, beef, goat, and pork. So we, as well as a number of aligned industry that are our associate members that we work with, including the individual guys such as the refrigerated warehouse and cold logistics groups. So we really are from post farm gate right through to plate. We represent all of those individual companies and the industry at large, and it's a very large portfolio and one that we continue to see our major issues in. And I note a question that just popped up then in regards to China, which I have to work with and work in a great deal. But obviously, what's weighing on us at the moment is COVID-19 management, and most importantly, what's going on in Victoria. So, looking forward to spending some time and providing some insights and answering some questions.
Thanks, Patrick. And yeah, that is a great question, James. And we will be coming to that. I might, once we've heard from Bob briefly, I might I've got a quick, slightly self-serving question, which is a little more general than that, but China, and in particular the opportunities in other markets, I think is a really interesting aspect that I'd like to hear more about as well. So Bob, as you can see, is from the Costco Wholesale Group, Assistant Vice President of Meat. Bob joins us from Washington, which I feared was an awful time zone, but it turns out it's not so bad. It's great when we have these international with webinars, that it's so much easier now to internationalize the discussion, and it's a lot easier these days than it probably was to make that happen. And so we really appreciate, Bob, you making the time. I'd be really interested to hear more about your role and how that relates not just generally to the broader sustainability of supply chains, but of course specifically in relation to Australia.
Very good. Thanks for having me, and good morning to you. A good evening from the Seattle, Washington area. Yes, I've been with Costco for 26 years, been in the meat industry for 22 of those 26 years. Started off as a cart pusher at a warehouse, which I think you call those trolleys in the audience. But yeah, great company to work for. We're a very large wholesaler / retailer. Our last reported fiscal year, we showed $149 billion in sales. We have well over 250,000 employees and 795 warehouses or stores across 13 different countries, and we have 12 in Australia. Over my time in the buying office, so I do oversee all proteins, so beef, pork, poultry, lamb, seafood, and we're a big customer of yours in the lamb business, and you provide us with phenomenal product that our members love. And I've sourced tens of millions of pounds of grinding materials, both conventional and organic grinding materials, from Australia for many, many years. So I very much appreciate the relationship that I've built with many of the producers, farmers, processors in Australia, and look forward to keeping that trend going.
Thanks, Bob. The slightly self-serving first question I was hoping to kick it off with is really just to get a little bit of insight from any or all of the panelists on that interplay between some of the longer term impacts on sustainability and how that's been developing, which is something, of course, that the sustainability framework and the steering group in particular we're paying real attention to. Our real aim here is to manage the broader longer term landscape, but of course everyone has to deal with the immediate impacts as well. So I'd be interested to hear from each of you any particular examples you have about how you think the longer, broader aspect of better recognition and integration of sustainable practices is manifesting in your area. And I think, Tim, maybe if I start with you, because you sitting with the MLA, you may have some particular research as well that you are aware of.
Thanks, Michael. So in terms of the trade and market access space, I might focus on that. We're seeing sustainability kind of manifest in a few different areas, and having the sustainability framework coming up behind us through the industry really supports how we see, I suppose, sustainability appear as a challenge and an opportunity in international markets. We're seeing it feature in some trade agreements. So particularly as we enter into negotiations with the UK and Europe, having sustainability credentials that we can demonstrate and show improvement on really helps there. And if you look at the Mercosur EU trade deal, that's currently held up because of the concerns that Brazil is burning the rainforest and those issues. So we see it appear there. We're seeing brands start to use it in international markets. So in Singapore, where I am, I can go to the butcher and get 2 carbon neutral beef brands. So it's definitely not a mainstream yet, but there is some niches in the market that we see that where consumers are wanting a sustainable product. And then Bob can probably talk to it a lot more effectively, but we're seeing big food service and retailers start to base their procurement decisions on sustainability measures.
Well, I did have some questions for Mark and Patrick as well, but that seems like a good point to say, Bob. To what extent are you finding in your role that you people understand the need for it, and secondly, you're able to to gain the confidence that you need in throughout the supply chain that the sustainable the substance is there?
Yeah, it's been becoming a more and more important part of our sourcing decisions. And as of a few years ago, we didn't even have our own quote unquote sustainability department at Costco, and we've since established that, which is good. It's a department that I work relatively closely with, but it's best that we leave the experts to that kind of stuff, because I've tried to educate myself over the years through the roundtable for sustainable beef in the U.S. and it's a lot to take in. So I'm glad that we have our own sustainability group, but it is important to us that we're doing the right thing. I mean, things such as the greenhouse gases and deforestation, they absolutely have to be taken into consideration when we're making buying decisions. And I say it's twofold. Number one, it's the right thing to do. Number two, at the rate of which we're growing, if we, from a business standpoint, if we don't put these things in place and change our sourcing practices, we're not going to have anything to sell. We won't be able to sustain this growth rate. So it's very important to us. Yeah,
and I imagine that if there's a disconnect in the supply chain, that creates issues as well. So, Patrick, I think sitting across the processed meats, have you is the processed meat sector actively, or how does it actively manage ensuring that all parts of the system are really aimed in the right direction?
Yeah, good question, Michael. Certainly from our point of view as an industry, the key thing that we're looking at when we talk about sustainability is it's probably threefold. One is about sustainability of our own manufacturing sites and industry overall. Secondly, it's then the sustainability within the supply chain, and then obviously thirdly, it's also sustainability within the supply chain about our suppliers. So we are doing a great deal of work, research, and making some very large investments, both third-party invested, individual company invested, and then obviously on other areas such as the utilisation of levies, where we're tackling areas such as the utilisation of alternative energy. So we've got a number of plants that are now using biogas, which is a self-sustaining, self-creating model that they have within their businesses. The creation and management of, and utilisation of biochar. There are wastewater techniques and management where we're actually reducing the amount of water we use. So we have that. Secondly, and to Tim's point around the carbon neutral brands being in Singapore, again, that's in the supply chain. So there's two things that we've got to remember there. One is that we can build a supply chain and have individual producers that can provide the individual products to meet the standards that can be audited. But I think that we sometimes very much wax lyrical about the wondrous nature of what we can do in a supply chain, and certainly starting from a production level. But they're individual producers that are doing that. Where, the key concern, not concern, but the key question we need to ask is, what is Industry Inc. doing? what sort of sustainability process can we actually apply where all of industry can play a part and where all of industry can then set its credentials. At the moment, the credentials have been set in very specific type supply chains underpinned by brands and potentially have the opportunity of getting better returns on the investments made. So I think that's where, there are a number of key aspects that we're looking at as an industry in that regard. Brands are going to be the leaders, we think, certainly over the next 3 to 5 years, because I don't think that all of industry is going to be capable already. And as the poor fool who invented livestock production assurance, I can tell you categorically that doing an all of industry program and then putting it in is not as simple as people make it out to be. And I think that time has told that even the simplistic of systems across all of production and then carrying that through to processing and then onto our consumers and underpinning that is fraught. So we've got to have a good hard look at it, and gives us the opportunity to be able to then effectively see what we can do as an all of industry, and then potentially what we can do above and beyond that through brands, because inevitably that's what the differentiation point for our customers are looking for.
Yeah, and that, again, from the perspective of someone sitting on the Sustainability Steering Group, that Australia Inc. approach, I think, is what, in my view, is what ultimately promotes long-term sustainability and market access internationally, and it differentiates us from other countries. And so for people like Bob who are making buying decisions, it makes it easier for them to both understand and appreciate the the value and the integrity in what we're doing. Now, Mark, just before I get on to James's question, because I do want to move on to some of the more immediate impacts on markets at the moment, and probably I think we'd all like to spend a bit more time on those things. But the live export industry, and I've had a lot to do with it as well, so I do understand you had to deal with a lot of challenges, particularly in the last sort of 15 to 20 years or so. And a lot of those have evolved sort of a bit like a slow moving train wreck in some instances, and a rebuild. But what are your perspectives on some of the key aspects of how the industry has or is still grappling with sustainability that impact on its markets and long-term prospects?
Yeah, in some ways, Michael, I think the industry needs to take a bit of a different interpretation on what sustainability is. And I think in our instance, it actually manifests itself in how we conduct ourselves in market. I mean, we're the only country in the world that has an assurance system that goes into market around animal welfare. Consumer sentiment can come into it to some extent because we do supply food service, and we are seeing shifting trends in some of our markets around those aspects. But I actually see sustainability for the live X industry really focusing on that animal welfare. But I think the other aspect to it is I see the trade dynamic. One of the things we've learned since COVID commenced was this real emphasis on food security in a lot of our trading markets. We generally supply what could be categorised as developing markets, and during a pandemic, food security is just heightened. And to use the example of the Middle East, I mean, the fact that frozen and chilled lamb, for instance, has found it harder to get in there. I mean, there's an increased reliance on livestock. So I think what sustainability could mean in the future for us is what role do we play as a broader industry around food security? We often focus on the premium and the high value, but we're also a bulk producer in Australia, whether we like it or not. So how can that translate into trade opportunities and broader economic sustainability for Australia's red meat industries?
Yeah, and that feeds nicely into James's question. James, did you want to jump on, or would you prefer I try not to butcher your question?
Sorry, mate. Michael, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good. Go for it.
Yeah, look, really just interested in that. Obviously, there are some concerns around the relationship with China, so that obviously creates some pressures in terms of what's going to happen with that market going forward. So, in light of that, do our panelists think we're actually doing enough to, as a country, as a government, as an industry, to shore up our relationship with key market and close neighbour like Indonesia?
Is that directed at me, James? Sorry.
Well, yeah, probably you Mark, maybe Tim, from a market perspective.
Yeah, look, I think we have to refocus a little bit on Indonesia. It is a nation that's probably grappling with the COVID-19 challenge, and I think we saw it in the past few weeks with that unfortunate incident where we saw some Australian cattle being slaughtered in a non-compliant manner. One of the interesting outcomes of that was a reaction from local authorities within that region, where one of the normal processes the regulator in Australia would go through is ask exporters to cease supply to that facility until processes can be sorted out and it can be established what happened. But we did have to spend a bit of time because that directive got misconstrued as almost a withdrawal of supply. And those facilities were the only two SCAS approved facilities in Aceh. So there was this moment where we were having to smooth over this concern that we're actually withdrawing supply completely. So we got that settled, but I think what it can demonstrate sometimes is a bit of a lack of respect to circumstances. I think we're very quick in imposing what we consider to be our standards. I think we just have to be a little bit broader in our thinking and often just contemplating what it looks like from our other markets' perspectives, particularly Indonesia. And of course, the other aspect that they have to that is their drive for long-term sustainability around their production systems as well. And, you know, quite flippantly, sometimes people go, well, I don't think that's possible, but that's not the point. I mean, I think we actually have to contemplate what steps can we do to assist them to reach those goals. So I think in essence, what I'm trying to say is I think we just have to be a little bit more cognizant of different perspectives. And I think that probably does translate to the government level sometimes in dealing with Indonesia. It's an incredibly important market.
Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I'll keep it brief. My only other comment, I suppose, is I think wherever you look now, particularly with COVID-19, there's a lot of risk in every market around the world, whether it's political or economic. We're going to have countries going into recessions or going into deeper recessions. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think a strategy that a lot of Australian businesses and the industry looks at is probably having a diversified export footprint, not having all our eggs in one basket.
Yeah, I think Patrick, and the processed meat sector and AMPC is an R&D organisation. I think I'm dredging my memory a little bit, but it spent many years sort of fairly actively researching how to broaden markets and where the real trigger points are. Are you seeing that's has that put the processed meat sector in a place of opportunity now where there's so much going on that's disrupting existing sort of markets?
Yeah, and look, I know that we've only got a few minutes and a few hours, so I really don't want to get too heavy into this, but I think going back into what James has actually asked around the current tensions and thinking, do we do enough to protect and build our relationship with other key markets in Asia? There's a bit of a misnomer that we've just decided to lose our minds and throw everything to China. We are an inverse manufacturer. So we take a whole, we create parts, and we sell to over 100 countries, all different parts, because they ask for different parts. We sell aortas into China. We sell sheep, goats' testicles into the Caribbean. We sell a range of other different products all over the world. But what happened in 2017 and beyond, or just as with Chapter and it kicking into gear, was that China decided it wanted to pay above the odds across the world for all parts. So in order for us to happily maintain a strong level of pricing back to producers, and now we have the world's most expensive cattle at the moment, it gave us the opportunity to be able to do that. We continue to be somewhat a victim of well, not a victim, but what I'd say is our industry, we ensure that I'm very vocal in the media around trade not being collateral damage during a relationship issue. And that is a relationship no matter where we are. So the recent John Deere issue is an issue that we find, that we face globally, where we have to make sure that we take these things as they are. We handle residue issues across the world from a port of entry testing issue. And Bob could talk about these for a while, but because it's China, it's news. That's as simply as put as that. So we already, as I said, we have diverted product to China because they're willing to pay. And now when they're not able to pay or it makes it more difficult, we can divert back. Japan still is a very strong market in grain-fed product. We've seen, obviously, the peaks and troughs of the US over this year that we've been able to take advantage of. But I want everyone to be abundantly clear. When we talk about FTAs are great if they coincide with effective management of non-tariff barriers. We have 3 different FTAs with Malaysia. We have a Malaysian FTA with Australia. We have the ANZFTA, the Australian, New Zealand and ASEAN FTA, and we have TPP11, and we're going backwards. And we're simply going backwards because of non-tariff barrier issues insofar as areas such as on religious grounds and halal. Now, we know very clearly that the same sorts of issues occur in Indonesia. We know that halal issues and shelf life issues, which we've solved in the Middle East, occur. But there are other ranges of other issues that we then have to continue to work on and maintain. And let us not forget, 20 years ago, we were staring down the barrel of a lamb 201 case in the US, where the US was going to impose stringent and heavy tariffs on Australian lamb to protect their own industry. Now, geopolitically, we're supposed to be brothers in arms, or big brother, little brother in arms. But effectively, I think that casually we've forgotten that, and we've now decided that on a marketing level, on a geopolitical level, we have a new individual group. As industry, we don't get that choice. We don't get the choice to pick favourites and friends. We go with we are the most reliable meat exporter in the world, and we're the most valuable red meat exporter in the world. And so therefore, in order to do that, we maintain that because we have these strong relationships. This is the 50th anniversary of containerised meat exports out of Australia. So we know what we're doing and we know how to do it. And everyone in the supply chain should recognise and realise that. The key is that when issues are occurring of this nature, if we're collateral damage, we have the opportunity to go to other markets. But it's not moving the Queen Mary, but it's also not turning around a tinny either. It is a very circumspect and deliberate moves that we have to make. FTAs work if other things work with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. I think Hannah also mentioned similarly in regards to Vietnam, but I got the sense that those answers collectively were really a broader, pretty much, Asia and anywhere else. But if there's anything anyone wants to add about Vietnam, please feel free. Deborah asked a question about Tim, a view about MLA. Just what sort of investments from levies is going to to deal with other export market issues and opportunities.
I'm just looking at the question as well. I think across the board with COVID at the moment, MLA's had to restructure its marketing spend quite considerably, purely because we can't host events, we can't have trade shows, we can't do a manner of things, and the whole marketing landscape's changed. So broadly, there's been a lot of change and a lot of rolling over of investments into the future to spend at a later date. I think importantly, China's still a massive market for Australia. Although there's tension and issues, it's still a major market and it's going to remain one. So MLA will still invest in marketing spend. Like Patrick said, I think although we've got the China, Australia FTA, non-tariff barriers are still a major issue. So there's still a lot being invested in that space, MLA, but also AMIC, AMPC, that are focusing on that area as well to make sure that non-tariff barriers don't inhibit us from actually utilising that trade agreement.
Thanks, Tim. Now we're getting close to the hard cut-off for at least Mark and Patrick, so I think there's a question for you, Bob, around from Darlene around natural and organic proteins or products, and also just that I think the differentiation between certification schemes and sustainability in a more sort of holistic or substantive sense. Whether that's how that impacts your decisions and what you have in mind when you're considering. Have you noticed a growth in those things or a change?
Michael, sorry, it's Patrick. I apologise. I probably will have to drop off to then get ready for this next one. Damn COVID, damn Victoria. But I just wanted to say, firstly, thank you very much for having me. And I'm leaving my email on the chat so that if anyone has any other questions, I'm more than happy to take that. And the only thing I would say as well is that in regards to Vietnam, we're doing a lot of work in there as well to expand and go there. But again, it's about the product range that we can provide. So that's there. So I'll leave my details there. And if anyone has a question that they wanted to ask me offline, I'm more than happy to get an email and answer it for them.
Thanks, Patrick. And thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. I think, Mark, we're about to lose you as well, I suspect. Thank you also for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. It's been very happy to do it. I think sustainability is one of the key things across the whole industry. And to your point around Vietnam, just to comment, if I may, on that, I think that's actually an example of the social impact or one of the different drivers that we need to contemplate in terms of red meat sustainability. Because I know in the framework we talk about worker well-being and making sure that we look after people in our supply chains. Well, Vietnam's a stark example because of the exponential economic growth there. One of the key drivers for live cattle exports there is actually the opportunity for supply chain employment, I suppose. It offers jobs and opportunities for people in Vietnam to process Australian cattle. And, you know, that's a big economic driver that's driving the growth in that industry. So, you know, we need to be cognizant that there's a workforce overseas as well when we think about how we look after people. But just on that sentiment, I'll leave it there and just thank everyone for their time.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.
So, Bob, I think we've got time just for me to revisit that question for you from Darlene. And it's a two-part one, really. The first one is just, Darlene says she'd be interested to hear from you around the growth in sales in natural and organic proteins. Is that something that you're seeing changing or increasing significantly?
Yeah, even pre-COVID, we were seeing some pretty good growth on the organics still, and we've been in organics for in the meat department, it's going on 13 years now, and still seeing really good growth. So that's positive. Australia's obviously been a huge supporter from a raw material standpoint for us, and the natural, it's getting bigger. I would say our member base is more interested in organic, but still dealing with limited supplies and whatnot. So, but what we're seeing is more so of the industry moving towards a natural program, antibiotic free. But yes, generally speaking, that is, you know, Costco's, I think, the largest organic retailer or retailer of organics in the world, and we continue to see good growth on that. So we keep building on a very large base. Very positive.
And And following on from that, Delaney was asking, and I'm interested too, is certification schemes is something that the steering group grapples with a bit as well. The difference between looking at substantive metrics that they're not necessarily aligned with any particular commercial approach, and then a certification scheme which takes a particular set of metrics and applies them in a certain way. Can you sort of explain how Costco addresses that or looks at certification schemes, and any major changes in how they've evolved in recent years?
Would that be as far as like organic certifications or food safety certifications?
Yeah, effectively, well, not so much. I think food safety is probably a little more evolved. So more in terms of the differentiating aspects of red meat. So whether it's GMO versus non-GMO or grass-fed versus another aspect of.
Yeah, we're seeing. I haven't seen a lot of interest in the non-GMO area. As far as the grass-fed has been growing, and I know that Australia is a good source for good grass-fed beef. Generally speaking, it seems our member base is very educated, college educated, college degrees and stuff. So I think that they do a little more studying on those things, and we're seeing pretty good demand across the board, and we're continuing to increase our offerings, whether it be inline in the warehouses or the stores, or even online. Online is a very big growth opportunity for us, and actually, when you have our warehouses, you have 4 walls, and so we're very limited on the items that we can offer. When you go on Costco.com, the landscape changes, and we're able to test some of these more niche items, if you will. But we're seeing good response on those.
Yeah, it does feel to me as well that consumers and everyone through the supply chain is getting quite sophisticated in how they differentiate product, and more and more the sustainability framework certainly is trying to tie those things back into a broad view of the economic, the social, the welfare, the different aspects of sustainability, so that when people are going to someone like Costco and making decisions about products, they understand, the key aspect that matters most to them, I guess. But I think, is there anything, Tim, we're a little over time, so I'll wrap it up here. I don't think we've got any more questions in the chat. Was there anything you wanted to note sort of as a closing comment?
I think we've teased out a few different issues. I think I've covered off most of my thoughts. I think in terms of bringing it back to sustainability, I think in certain markets it's already a hot topic, and we're seeing that come through in many ways. In many of the Asian markets, it's still more of an emerging issue and less mainstream, but it's definitely shifting towards that. And I think having things like the sustainability framework coming through really give us credibility to address various conversations around sustainability in these markets, be it Europe or being certain parts of Asia. So that's all from me. I'll finish it there.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I think one of the things you mentioned in your talk that I was going to ask Bob a bit about as well was just that inward-outward aspect of when there are real challenges to international challenges like we face now with COVID, or whether there are internal structural issues that create risk for the local industry. That there's a bit of a flexing between a more inward and outward facing view of the world. Bob, as a Costco, or from the perspective of Costco, how do you see that developing over the next couple of years within the US?
Well, I think the long list is going to continue to get longer. Right. It's never going to get easier. Yeah, I mean, as each year goes by, there's increased competition from different countries for product. Back in the day, when our volumes were much smaller, there was less of a concern of being able to make sure that we have enough product to sell to cover our needs. And now with China stepping into the marketplace and all these different countries, the competitive landscape is different, and it has created a lot of volatility. So just the volatility is hard to navigate sometimes, but you throw COVID in there, and now all of a sudden we're sourcing product from Australia halfway around the world, and there's logistical challenges now. Lamb sales are through the roof, and we're even to the point where we're flying lamb every week to the extent that we can. But then again, if tourism is down, there's less airplanes going back and forth, and so it just seems that as soon as you think that you're starting to figure this thing out, something new gets thrown at you, and you just have to figure that out too. But there's a lot of things. I heard somebody mention, even the human rights piece of it. It's, you dig deeper and deeper into industries, and sometimes you find really good things, and sometimes you find things that we need to improve on. And that's what we're here for. We need to make the whole system better.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And that volatility is one of the more interesting aspects of this, I think, and something that I think when sustainability is being sort of progressed as best it can, and I think Australia is doing very well on that front, then you give yourself the best chance of navigating or possibly even smoothing out some of that volatility. But there are plenty of things you can't control, obviously. That's really useful insight, Bob. Thank you. And also to you, Tim. Thanks, everyone. Sorry to keep us all a bit longer. Really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you to everyone on the panel. Mark and Patrick not being with us, obviously. The Sustainability Steering Group will write up a sort of some key points and outcomes from today's session and of the previous webinars that we have with the Consultative Committee, and make those available. And hopefully, sometime in the not too distant future, we'll be back to a situation where we can actually all get in a room together and enjoy each other's company while going through some of these issues. So thank you, everyone, for your time. I really enjoyed the session, and it was great to have you all. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.